You guys, I don't care what the Nashville scene has to say. Ramsey Solutions is not a cult. And you know how I know? Because I've been in one. And it wasn't nearly this much fun. We were not allowed to drink bourbon or smoke cigars, and I wasn't even allowed to have a job. So we should all be very grateful. But just in case you've ever kind of wondered, like, is there something fishy going on here? Maybe someone you love is getting into something odd. I thought I would share with you a few signs that you may be in a cult based on real life experience. Sign number one is that you dress like a character from Little House on the Prairie. This is my obligatory, look how cute I was as a kid picture. Sign number two is that your parents have a quiver full of arrows. If you've been there, you know what this phrase means. I am the second oldest of 7 children. Here I am in the middle. And this is our foster brother, Billy, pictured here as well. And this was not unusual in the communities I was a part of. Lots of families had 8, 9, 10, even a few families we knew with 12 children. My mom is incredible. She birthed, raised, and yes, homeschooled 7 human beings. Like, this is unimaginable to me. Like, I'm at a point in my life where I'm like, could I keep a dog alive? Another sign you might be in a cult. You get around in a 15-passenger van because how else would you? This is the car I learned how to drive in. My mom called it the Bible bus. Because it was inordinately large and white, my dad called it Moby Dick. He was never really fully bought into the whole cult thing. Another sign you might be in a cult is that you believe people who own Barbies or listen to the Beatles are going to hell. Actual beliefs I held between the ages of about 6 and 12. And lastly, another sign you might be in a cult is that your first year of college feels like season 1 of the unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. You just go crazy, like it's nuts out here, right? Okay, so Ramsey is a unique place. Just for a quick show of hands, if you're willing to be vulnerable, is this ringing true for anybody else in here? You're like, yep, okay, homeschool families, lots of weird stuff. And for the rest of you guys, show of hands if I just confirmed every stereotype you've ever had of homeschoolers. It's funny because it's true. So, what was it exactly? I'm sure you're wondering by this point. By the way, the poster that Olivia made, can we get a shout out for Olivia and her incredible work? It's a real picture of the leader of the organization I was a part of. For a number of years, my family and I were involved in the Institute of Basic Life Principles, which was founded by this gentleman here, Bill Gothard, not Gaither. It was founded in 1961, but it reached its peak in like the 80s and 90s, and they targeted ultra-conservative homeschool families, and they did a lot of different things to get people involved. They mainly hosted conferences and seminars throughout the country. They produced a ton of content, which we'll take a look at in a minute. My family was never in as deep as we could have been, but it definitely left an impact on me. So a few other notable members of this cult included the Duggar family. Maybe you've heard of them. A lot of arrows in that quiver. And Naomi Parton. This photo is real. It was used with permission. You can ask her about her experiences later. When we found out, she's my other desk buddy. Era's on one side, Naomi's on the other. When we found out we were both in IBLP, we're like, what? Yeah. So as I said before, they produced a ton of content. And one of the things that we would do for our homeschool curriculum was go through these things called the wisdom booklets. And here's a few sample lessons of what we would learn. This one was entitled, How Are Eyelids Used for Seductive Purposes? This keyword may not be too hard to rank for. I don't know. We did a deep dive into the book of Proverbs on this one. We learned about how naughty people winketh with their eyes, how evil women signaled their malintent by winking. And you know what's funny is as I was working through this presentation, I realized like I'm really bad at winking. Like my whole face contorts, like I'm not good at it. And I think maybe it's some like leftover religious trauma. Like the body keeps the score. I should call the Dr. John Deloney show. Here's another lesson. Eye traps. This was a big thing. We spent a lot of time analyzing women's outfits. Can you identify the eye traps in these pictures? And what could you do to alter them? And yes, all three of these outfits were considered immodest. An eye trap was anything that would draw attention away from a woman's face and to the fact that she even had a female figure. So in number one, this lace is extremely eye-catching and alluring. That's the eye trap in number one. In number two, it's the distracting pattern on the sweater, the deep V necklace, drawing attention away from the face. And in number three, I think it was the low waistline, the elongated torso. Also, she probably should have been wearing pantyhose. So another lesson, this one was big. This one's probably the one that buried its way deepest into my psyche, was the umbrella of authority. Gothard was huge on authority and on submission to authority. So we would learn about how Christ would, and I don't really remember all this stuff. There's something weird about the authority to forgive sins passed down to the pastors from Christ, but basically Christ was over the pastors, who were over the husbands, who were ruled over their wives, who were able to manage their children and at home. And I remember at one of these conferences specifically being told, here I was located under the umbrella of my mom and therefore my dad, and under no circumstance was I to transfer outside of that umbrella until I got married, found a new umbrella, lest I incur the wrath of God. And as a 31-year-old woman with no umbrella, things are going okay. I'm happy to report. So far. Okay, so this is all very weird and bizarre, right? But why am I talking today about this with you all? Maybe you grew up, like we mentioned before, in a similar environment and you're feeling seriously triggered right now, and I'm very sorry. Maybe you didn't. You have no idea what this whole world is about. But I want to unpack a few things that I've learned in my walk with the Lord as I've detangled myself from some of these toxic teachings. And I hope that what I have to say will be helpful for you on a personal level and on a professional level. Because regardless of where you come from, you work at a company with this mission statement. We provide biblically based common sense, education, and empowerment that give hope to everyone in every walk of life. As a content producer at this company, I take this charge very seriously. This is a big, bold claim that we are making. And organizations like the one I was a part of growing up ostensibly also wanted to teach biblical principles. James 3:1 says, not many of you should be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be held to a higher standard. So how do we do this at Ramsey in our professional lives? How do we do this as followers of Christ in a way that's going to lead people to hope, like we want to do, and not to despair? That doesn't give them an empty promise. This is a big deal. And I think what I'm going to do the next couple minutes is talk about this tension that exists in Scripture, and specifically in the person of Jesus Christ, a tension that exists between truth and grace. I know these are churchy words, but I grew up in an environment that was heavy-handed on truth. That's all I ever heard. I don't even remember people telling me that God loved me for years and years. Some of you came from a background that was all about grace, right? And in our cultural context where we find ourselves today in the West, that's kind of our default mindset, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But what we see in Jesus is a perfect blend of the two of these things, and both are necessary to bring people the hope that we are wanting to give them. So I'm going to walk you through three confessions of things that I've learned throughout my time with this background in mind. Confession number one, I tried desperately to be good enough. I've always wanted to do the right thing and make the umbrellas happy, make God happy. And I just found that I was always falling short. This is a picture of 9-year-old Rachel at one of these cult conferences in Knoxville, Tennessee, actually. And this weekend, we learned the basics of biblical womanhood and hospitality. We memorized the entirety of Proverbs 31. We sang songs about the umbrella of authority. I think we learned how to bake bread and brew kombucha and stuff. And I just remember the whole time feeling like one wrong move and I was just going to get in trouble. Always watched, always monitored. The default setting was a mindset of condemnation. And I grew up in church environments with spiritual people, authorities over me, reminding me of verses like Jeremiah 17:9 all the time. Your heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Or the verse in Isaiah that says, all your righteous works are like filthy rags. I remember a small group leader telling me there's nothing you can do to make God happy. And I just felt like God was pissed off at me all the time, although I wasn't allowed to say that word. Pure truth is damning. If you've been in a religious environment where you felt this, you feel it in an emotional, a mental, and a bodily level. You can never be good enough. And, we often think about this idea of truth and law as like an Old Testament thing. Like Jesus really lightened things up, and he liked to go to parties and hang out with tax collectors, and that's all true. But what's astounding is when we look at like the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus actually ups the ante. He's talking about adultery, for example. And he's like, okay, well, maybe you've never actually cheated on your spouse. But who of us in this room hasn't taken a second or a third glance at somebody? Indulged in a fantasy. We all have the seed of an adulterer in our hearts. Same with murder. He wraps up that sermon by pointing out the super religious guys of the day, the Pharisees, who spent all day, every day trying to be good. That was their job, trying to keep the law and teach others to do the same. And he said, guys, everybody listening to me, if you want to be a part of this kingdom, if you want to have a relationship with me, my Father, you've got to be better than the Pharisees. You must be better than the best person you know. He wraps up the sermon by saying, you have to be perfect. And the goal of this wasn't for us to walk away and take the Sermon on the Mount as a roadmap and follow all the steps. The goal of this was to say, I can't do this. Like I already messed up before I finished my first cup of coffee this morning. And another thing that I learned during this time was that it's possible, like the Pharisees, to be very far away from God while trying to be very good. The Pharisees were his most fierce opponents. They stiff-armed God on the way to trying to create their own sense of worth and righteousness. So this is depressing, and I'm feeling sad. Let's go on to confession number 2. I thought Band-Aids could fix bullet holes. And yes, this is a quote from Taylor Swift. Didn't learn about her in the cult, though. So truth is uncomfortable, and it doesn't work anyway. It sucks. So another thing that we do in our hearts is that we swing to this other end of the pendulum towards grace. And we say, you know what? Deep down, basically, we're all good. We're just all encountering a lot of roadblocks, whether it's personal trauma, whether it's what's happening in our society, it's the patriarchy. Deep down, we're good. We just need to find this inner source that will unleash our ability to live up to our full potential as human beings. This is where we find ourselves in our cultural context in a post-Christian, postmodern, relativistic culture. We talk a lot about the toxic money culture, and Ken has spoken from stage before about the toxic work culture. I've gotten the privilege to write for Deloney and Christie about the last year and a half or so, and had my head in the space of the personal development and self-help culture. And I'm seeing a lot of scary things in our culture about what I'm calling the toxic self-love. And so I wanted to show you a clip from an expert talking about this problem.
I don't get the mirrors, I don't want to see myself working out. I know what I look like. That's why I'm going to the gym. Obviously, there's some people that do want that, right? They're like, if I'm going to be working out, I want to look at something like myself. I want to look at myself while I work on myself. I should do a recording so I can listen to myself while I look at myself while I work on myself. As I leaf through my Self magazine. Read how myself can improve myself. Maybe I'll go to my Facebook page and look at photos of myself. Read what myself has written about myself. Yo soy muy importante. Myself.
I don't know how I keep going after a Jim Gaffigan bit. I should just go home. So instead of condemning ourselves, we try to love ourselves into a state of goodness, right? We see this all the time on, Instagram, on our self-help titles of books that we see in the store. Messages like, you're perfect just the way you are. You determine your truth. All of your feelings are valid. You are flawless. We desperately want to believe these things about ourselves. You are a badass. You're more than enough. The universe, the entire universe has your back. Or maybe you just need to wash your face. Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. The solutions that the world is offering are not enough. I love the way that an author I read for this, real quick. Pure truth, we talked about earlier. Pure truth is damning, but pure grace is powerless. It's not fixing the problems that we have if we're really honest about the deep, deep issues and insecurities that exist in every one of our hearts. So I read this book in preparation for this talk called You're Not Enough and That's Okay. It's by Allie Beth Stuckey. I wanted to share this quote with you. She says, our sufficiency isn't the answer to insecurity, and self-love isn't the antidote to our feelings of self-loathing. Why? Because the self can't be both the problem and the solution. If our problem is that we're insecure and unfulfilled, we're not going to be able to find the antidote to these things in the same place our insecurities and fear are coming from. And isn't it funny that all of these types of books are telling us we're flawless? But also, you really need my book because you clearly have issues. Okay, so if pure grace isn't the answer, pure truth isn't getting us anywhere, where do we turn? My third confession is I looked for hope in principles, but found it in a person. Lisa Harper said on Wednesday, I guess, when she was talking to us, her favorite gospel is the book of Mark. Mine is the book of John. I love how poetic and symbolic. He's just an incredible, incredible writer. He opens his book by talking about the law. The law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. We see this in every interaction he had with the people of his day. One day, Jesus was teaching at the temple, and probably surrounded by a group of men. Maybe some women were there, I don't know, but there was probably a lot of influential men listening to him teach. And a group of these Pharisees, these super religious guys we've been talking about, interrupted his teaching, and they dragged before him a woman that they had found in one of the most shameful and dark places of her life, potentially having made one of the worst mistakes ever. They bring her and they put her in his midst. They're not interested in truth. They're not interested in grace here. Scripture says, John says that they were there to test Jesus. They put this woman out there and they say, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery." Now in the law, Moses commands us to stone such women. They would have been justified in picking up rocks right then and killing her on the spot. They say, "What do you say, Jesus?" And I love, he's totally unfazed. He bends down, he starts doodling in the dirt. What was that about? I don't know. After a few minutes, he straightens up and he looks at them and he's like, "Okay, those of you without sin, go for it. Cast the first stone." I love how Jesus just powerfully peels back the layers of our hearts and so graciously shows us things that we were so blind to before. These men, one by one, they go away, starting with the older ones first. And once they're all gone, I imagine by this point she's probably kind of cowering down in fear. Can you imagine how scared she was, how shameful she felt? And Jesus gets down on her level and he says, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She says, "They're gone, Lord." And he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin." Have you ever had a moment like this with Christ, where all of your sin and all of your shame was in front of him and he loved you anyway? When I was 17, like I told you earlier, I don't really remember having heard the words, "God loves you." If I did ever hear him, there was a huge caveat attached to it about how sinful I was. But for the first time, when I was 17 years old, I was meditating on Ephesians 3:14 through 21. I highly encourage you to go take a look at that passage if you've never dwelt on it. Paul is praying. He's like, "I'm praying that you would be able to grasp somehow, that you get a small glimpse of God's big love for you. It's like the ocean. You can't even fathom it. But I hope that you get a little bit of a sense of how deep and wide and long and high it is." And for the first time ever, I had this experience. I grew up with all the truth in the world, and I finally experienced grace. And nothing has ever been the same since that moment. Guys, I think one of the biggest misconceptions about our faith is that it's the world's most well-organized self-improvement behavior modification program. But the gospel message, the work and person of Jesus Christ, is that he didn't come to make bad people good. He came to make dead people alive. And that's a very different problem that we have. Ephesians 2, 1 through 10 spells this out so beautifully. Another passage I think we should all maybe take some time to look at this weekend. We were dead in our trespasses and sins. What can you do when you're dead? Nothing. You don't need a proven path. And I know I'm not picking on us. I love all that stuff we do. But you don't. If you're dead, laying on the table, you need an external force acting upon you to bring you life. And this is the message of who Jesus is and the work he's done. And it's the reason that he can say to this woman, I don't condemn you. He has the power to do it because he knew in just a short time he was going to the cross. He had lived the perfect life. He was going to die this death. He was going to overcome death and offer her a solution that actually worked. This is the opportunity we have to share with people this reality, to make the introduction. Like I said, I love our teachings. I love our principles. To quote Lisa Harper again, she said that we do like guerrilla spiritual warfare. The principles we teach are good and they're important. But remember how Dave signs off his time on the radio. He says the only way to true financial peace is to walk daily with the Prince of Peace, Christ Jesus. Life transformation happens in the context of relationship with the living God. And there's nothing else in the world that can compare to this. So I wish we had more time. We don't have a lot of time for these reflection questions. I don't know if you want to write them down or take a picture, but I'm just curious, where does this land on you? Like, which side do you tend to fall on? Too much truth or too much grace? What does your upbringing have to do with your mindset on this? What season of life are you in that's forcing you to one end of the spectrum or the other? And what do you need from Jesus today? Is he nudging you towards one direction or the other? How do we as a company live in this tension of truth and grace? We talk a lot about scaling our trajectory as a company, and I think a lot about our spiritual trajectory. Like, what's going to keep us doing this well, like I mentioned earlier, to be living in the tension of both of these things? And I'm totally paraphrasing Suzanne here from last week. But if our ultimate goal is to provide hope by leading people to Jesus, how does your work connect with that mission? What does that look like as long as you are here on this team doing the job that you're called to do? Guys, this is exciting. This is what people are desperate for. Dave has been saying a lot from stage recently that Jesus is the antidote. And I just think it's amazing that we get to work to bring that to people. So if you're wondering if my family ever made it out of the cult, we did, and we're doing great. No, when you have a big family and you're all spread out, you take every opportunity you can to get a family picture. And it turns out axe throwing is really nice group therapy. We're doing really well now. We're fairly normal. The same parents who prayed for 6 months about whether or not I should get my ears pierced when I was 13 years old are the same parents who took my youngest sister, Liz, in the pink shirt, to a tattoo parlor on her 17th birthday so they could sign for her to get her first tattoo. Doesn't that drive you nuts if you're an older sibling? You're like, I did all the work. You're getting a tattoo? But it's been a process. I remember the day that everything changed and we finally decided we are done with this. We're getting out of here. My dad had had enough. We were in the living room, seated around him under the shade of his umbrella. He was leading us through one of these lessons, and the topic of the lesson was how to identify a rebellious spirit, or in other words, how to be super judgy. And the activity that we were supposed to do was you were supposed to load up your kids in the Bible bus and take them down to the nearest supermarket parking lot and observe people's appearances as they went in and out of the store. And for example, if you saw a woman with purple hair and facial piercings, why were they always picking on women? I don't know. You could tell your kids that obviously she had a spirit of rebellion. And my dad, after all those crazy conferences and these weird-ass wisdom booklets, the years of measuring my skirt before I left the house, he was fed up. He stood up and he took the book and he said, "We are done with this crap." And he threw it on the floor. And we sat in stunned silence. And I leaned over to my older brother, Micah, and I said, "What does crap mean?" Thank you for your time.